want to talk for a few minutes about the Tower of Babel, found in Genesis 11. And so I've entitled this program, A City, a Tower, a Name. And this is a representation of the Tower of Babel, not necessarily based on any architectural drawings or anything of that matter, or any actual archaeology as well, just simply an artist's concept of what the tower could have looked like. So we've already covered what David has spoken about. The fall of man impacted all life in the universe, and the flood impacted the entire globe, certainly. In fact, the world was covered with water twice. Once in the very first day when God created the earth, it was covered with water, and a second time during the flood, whereas evolutionary theory has as one of its tenets that the earth was never completely covered with water. But here's the ark, and so we obviously recognize that there were 8 people who were saved through the flood event with all the animals. And if you think about it, if God's purpose was to cleanse the society of sin and to kill all those humans who were sinful, he would have to either kill all the animals at the same time, or he would have to create an ark, something that would help those animals as well as the few people to survive. So it just made sense that the ark was filled with the animals of different kinds, so that the kinds could be continued in the post-flood world. So here we are in the post-flood world. This is an artist's rendering of the sign that God made, the Noahic covenant that God made, that even though it would rain now in the post-flood world, and in those clouds with the refraction of sunlight, it would be a bow of the rainbow, which would be God's promise not to kill off humankind again by another flood. And so when it comes to the Tower of Babel, he had to come up with another kind of a judgment rather than killing people via the flood. And this is depicting the animals having been released from the ark, and depicting Noah and his family giving sacrifice as a soothing aroma back up to God for his deliverance. And it's just a depiction of how different the post-flood world would have been from the pre-flood world. And there are some interesting differences. So if there was a vapor canopy before, there is now no vapor canopy. There are clear skies except when it's raining. The rainbow, of course, as the reminder to God of his covenant with Noah that he would never flood the world again. There was a decrease in certainly oxygen. I don't want to say concentration here. I should say the oxygen partial pressure, the pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere. There were cold polar regions now. No continuous warm climate all around the earth. There were tectonic plate movements in the hundreds of years after the flood that caused mountains to arise to great heights. There was a growing ice age in the northern latitudes that impinged on certainly northern Europe and northern the Americas. And because of that growing ice age, there were lower ocean levels, and they revealed land bridges across which animals and people could cross from one continent to another. There was a growing population but declining lifespan. And we've seen this before in the previous talk, that Noah may have lived 950 years. He lived for quite a long time after the flood. And his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, had slightly shorter lives than Noah did. And here showing Shem at 600 years, and those in Shem's line as having shorter and shorter lengths of life, all the way down to Abraham at 175. So we read Genesis 11 as a historical narrative, and you don't need to read on the slide unless you're interested to read with me. It says, "Now the whole earth used the same language and the same words. It came about as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they used brick for stone, and they used tar for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven. And let us make for ourselves a name, otherwise we will be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language. And this is what they began to do. And now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth. So here's another representation of yet another rendition of the tower, with inclined sort of spiral walkway around the outside. So these verses show us that there was one language in the earth, and there wasn't an evolution of language. Evolution meaning from grunts and groans of our ape-like ancestors up into things that made verbal sense. Rather, this language was already there. It was probably the language that Adam used, and his family and on down is probably the original language that was given to Adam that he used for conversation. They lived and began to live on the plain of Shinar. This is really it means between two rivers, is what the word Shinar means. And in this area around Babylon, there were no stones. So if there are no stones, it's hard to build anything without stone. But what they did was they had the technology, the know-how in their culture to make bricks. So here we have a known technology of brick making, and the idea of them coming together and saying, "We know how to do this, we know how to make bricks, let's stick together and make bricks, and let's make our own tower that reaches up to the heavens." And as the time went along, there were the death of those people who knew Noah. And those who knew Noah knew that Noah knew who Lamech was, and Lamech knew Adam. As we looked at that chart, you could see in just 3 generations, or 3 of these people's lives, you can get back to Adam. But as you progress on, those people who knew Noah and who knew Lamech and who knew Adam died. And there was a tendency to forget God, because the question would be, how is God communicating with people in a fallen state at this time? And it could be that God simply was not communicating, and so they had no real relationship with God as they began to build this tower. And because of that, and the fact that people are sinful by nature, and they continue to be sinful even after the flood and after being rescued in the flood, the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, they had rebellion in their hearts. And that was what drove their building. And they said, "Come." And this is a clarion call for rebellion against God. Come, everybody, to this plain. Come, everyone. We are going to stand together, united against God in this rebellion. We don't need God. We don't need what God provides. We can provide it for ourselves. And this is exactly against what God's command was in Genesis 9:1 and verse 7. "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth," or populate the earth. God was clearly saying he wanted people to disperse throughout the earth, and this call for rebellion was to come to this place and time and not disperse. Otherwise they would be, as they said, dispersed, scattered among the earth, among the peoples of the earth. And they said, "Let us build for ourselves a city." This wasn't a city for God. It was a city that would be for the people who were there, to live as they wished they could, as they wanted to live in independence of God, a city that they could be proud of, a city that they could be known for, even after people did move away and colonize other parts of the world. It's a city that has unity without God. it's a city that has a tower in it whose top reaches up to heaven, the abode of God. And so maybe there was a religious symbolism as well in this tower, that they could have their own way of entering heaven with this tower. And it had a name, and they were proud of that name. They would make themselves a name. They were self-reliant people. Instead of going about and moving to other places where they were, not sure of how their life was going to be as they moved from one area to another, there was the questions of how are you going to eat? How are you going to live? How are you going to stay warm? How are you going to, have a religious nature in your culture? As you move into new places, there's always this uncertainty with how things will go in a new place. And we even experience this to some degree if we just simply move from one place to another in the country. Today we have these same things. We have to build back our relationships with people. We have to build back the infrastructure of our lives as we have moved from one place to another. And instead of doing that, they're saying, let's stay together. Let's be reliant on ourselves. We know how to live. We know how to feed ourselves. We know how to build. We can be independent of God, and we can have our own government. This would be the first world government. We would govern ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered, was the idea. That scattering across the world was a bad thing. This was clearly in conflict with God's be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. That is in fact the way the biology of life is designed. Biology of life is designed to replicate itself, to scatter via seed, to scatter via the seed of new organisms from one place to another, and to fill the earth. Typically if you put an area of freshly turned dirt in your yard, you'll see very quickly that things spread into that and sprout. Wild onions, etc. Unless you plant something in there, God will have other ideas as to what needs to be planted in there, and you'll end up with weeds and all kinds of things. But the biology of life is designed to be fruitful and multiply, and they were denying that sin here is stronger in unity than in separation to being scattered. So this is what they were up to in the clarion call for rebellion against God. And God came down and confused the languages. And I'm not sure what the original languages were, but clearly they were enough to cause immense frustration in the part of the people. They would first have to find all the other people who spoke the same language as they, and they would clearly feel more comfortable with that because they could communicate one to another. And then they would say, well, we can't communicate with this group over here. Why don't we move away and start something that is more reflective of our own culture and our own language? And the languages were given by God, and they were complicated, nuanced languages that are the basis for the world languages today. And if you see, there are some suggestions about when they did move, where did they move, and who went with them. So up to the north and to the west, these are the descendants of Japheth, went up to the northern European areas and probably ended up living in caves because of the cold temperatures up there and the ice. The descendants of Ham went over to Africa, and the descendants of Shem went down into the Sinai Peninsula and went east towards Asia. And one other depiction is simply where they would have gone further afoot than that, where they would have further gone into northeast of Asia up to the Bering Land Bridge, and would have crossed over the Bering Strait and come to the Alaska area, come down through the Rockies and to North America, and eventually through the Isthmus down to South America. So God did in judgment what the people would not do in obedience. In obedience, they were to multiply and fill the earth and move to the uttermost parts, but God said, no, if you won't do that willingly, I will force it to happen. And of course, this process took time. It wasn't an instantaneous thing, because travel in those days was much slower. And so you should be able to over time, see different civilizations erupt, fully formed, because people would have taken with them their culture, the culture of Babel, the culture of technology that they used in building with bricks, and the fact that they would have also probably built temples like pyramids or ziggurats. And so what we have here is a representation of the spread of civilizations through time, starting out in the center, in the yellow portion here in Mesopotamia, near Babylonia, near Babylon. And they're numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, going down into Africa, 7, and as you move to the east, 3, 4, 5 to the Near East, and then as you go up towards the far northeast, 6 and 9, and as they cross over, you get into 11 and 12. How people in different cultures would have, over time, created cultures in those varied areas. They didn't all have the same culture simultaneously, but they took their culture with them and inhabited the islands and Australia, and also North and South America. And so this particular representation also has with it, by colors, the dates in terms of time BC for each of these particular civilizations, and it is possible to see this sequential construction of civilizations as they move out. And those civilizations also had, as part of their cultures, pyramids and ziggurats and mounds. So the dispersion, although they were gone from the center where the tower was, they took with them the desire to build a tower, thinking that is part of the religious aspect of getting to God. And so around the world, we see these towers in different countries, and we see mounds, and we see commonalities around the world in ritualistic rites that could have been very similar to what was found in Babel. And the question is, well, what about today? What are we doing today? Well, today we have a continuous rebellion. We're still in rebellion against God, and we're still building towers. We're still building cities. We're still building a name for ourselves. And so here, head and shoulders above the rest, is what this says. These are different buildings around the world, and these are the names of the buildings and the area where they are: Shanghai, Taipei, Chicago. It says the Willis Tower, and then of course the Burj Dubai in Dubai, which is the largest structure in the world. But we're still in rebellion, are we not? We still want to have a city where we can do whatever it is that we want. We still want to have a tower that draws people to it, that says that this is a unique place. And we still want to have a name that says our name is above the name of God, and we don't have to bow our knees to God because we have these things. We are independent of God, and we have a great deal of pride in our accomplishments. And certainly we demonstrate that by building these large monuments. So the judgments of God that we've seen so far today, as Dave has spoken about the fall of man, the flood, and this was a judgment on the people based on the building of a tower and confusing of the languages. These are three major instances in Genesis 1 through 11 of God's judgments. And the question for us now is there any hope at all? If we're all under judgment and continuously under judgment, what hope is there for us? And to share with us that hope, I'd like to invite David to come on up to the podium and finish off our time together.